Welcome to the Personal History Hub. So today we're going to be focusing on how to answer a certain exam question. So the exam question that we're going to be looking at are the how useful are sources A and B for an inquiry about question. Right, so this is the second question on paper one. So we're going to be looking at a paper one example today. It's worth 8 marks. So for us, it appears on section A, the medicine on the Western Front section. But it's really important to understand this question properly because it does also appear on paper three, USA. So that could be civil rights or Vietnam, which is why there's the picture of the paper three textbook there, just to remind you that this question is going to be used on both papers. Okay, so it's really important to understand it. So we're going to have a look at an example for the Western Front today. So Western Front content. How you answer the question is exactly the same for paper three. So you can apply this exact same method to any question you're doing for paper three, the USA section. So this is the question that we're going to be having a look at today. So let's read the question at the top over here. So how useful are sources A and B for an inquiry into the treatments that were available for the wounded on the Western Front? So it says explain your answer using sources A and B and your knowledge of the historical context. So if we look down here in the 6 to 8 mark bracket, which is where we should be aiming, should notice as well that it says here uses own knowledge and provenance to reach a judgment. Okay, so we're not just using two sources here. We've got to also use our own knowledge and provenance. Don't worry if you're not too sure on provenance at the moment. We will be discussing that in a second. So let's have a quick read of the sources that we're going to be using for this question first before I break down how to answer this. So these are the two sources. So let's have a quick read of them together. So source A, this one at the top here. Source A is from Harvey Cushing's A Surgeon's Journal, 1915 to 1918, published in 1936. Cushing was an American surgeon, and the book included extracts from the journal that he kept at the time. Here he is describing the conditions that he worked under during the Battle of Passchendaele on August the 19th, 1917. So this is what he says. My prized patient Baker, with the shrapnel ball removed from his brain, after doing well for 3 days, suddenly shot up a temperature to 104 last night about midnight. I took him to the operating theatre, reopened the perfectly healed wound, and found a massive gas infection of the brain. I bribed 2 orderlies to stay up with him in the operating room, where he could have a warm saline solution passed along the path taken by the shrapnel to prevent infection. No light except candles was allowed last night. And then source B at the bottom here is a photograph of a mobile X-ray unit in 1917. So you'll always be given, so like this caption here of B and this little description here of A, you'll always be given a little bit of context and a description or a caption if it's a picture. Okay. So you might get given two sources like this. So why one is written and one is an image. You might get given two written, or you might get given two images. There's no pattern to it at all. It could be any of those combinations. Okay, don't panic if you get two images. We'll talk about what we do with images in a second. So a couple of top tips before we start tackling this question. Okay, so my top tips for this question are that you can think of this question as a 3-point checklist, and you must include all three of these points. So whether you're doing this on paper one or paper three, this is the three things that you must include for each source. So you have to include what the source suggests about the topic that you're given. Okay, so don't forget, a big slip up on this is people not reading the question properly and selecting quotes or making inferences about something completely random. So ours is about treatments on the Western Front. Okay, somebody might make a mistake and talk about wounds instead. So it's really important that you focus on the question, you give an inference, and you use some quotes, or if it's a picture, descriptions. Okay, so please don't be put off by a picture source. Just simply describe what you can see, say what you see of the source. Once you've done that, you must use your own knowledge to back up those quotes. Okay, you will not be getting in that top level band, or probably you won't be getting more than half marks at all, really, if you do not use your own knowledge to back up those quotes. So you've got to know your stuff for this question. And then you've got to mention why the provenance makes the source either useful or not useful. Okay, so we'll discuss provenance in a second when we get to that bit, but I would always go for 2 useful, 1 not useful. Okay, so as long as you tackle those 3 things, so it's like a little 3-point checklist for each source, okay, you will nail this question. So a couple of extra tips before we start. I would structure the question in 2 big paragraphs, so don't try and overcomplicate it. So one for source A and one for source B. Okay, then you won't be overcomplicating it at all by doing lots of little paragraphs. So one for source A, use that 3-point checklist for A. One for source B, use that 3-point checklist for B. You will never have to compare the sources. So you don't have to be writing long conclusions and things where you're saying A is more important than B is more useful than A. Okay, you don't have to do that at all. So tackle them completely separately. You don't have to compare them. So let's have a go at constructing an answer for our question. So we're going to be starting with source A. So we're really going to break this down. So forget source B for now. Let's just go back to source A. So let's have another look at the source this time. So this was source A. So if you want to pause it and read it again, you can do. So remember that the question is about treatment. So the question is, how useful are sources A and B about treatments for the wounded on the Western Front? So it's not asking us to identify wounds. So we need to select 2 quotes that we can use from the source to tell us about treatments for soldiers on the Western Front. So a common error in this is that sometimes students might select a quote like this: found a massive gas infection of the brain. Well, that's not really focused on the question, because that's talking about the gas infection itself. That's talking about the injury, the wound. Okay, we need to think about treatment. So if you want to pause the video now and maybe think about which 2 quotes you could select before I show you my 2. Okay, so here is the first quote that I've selected: the shrapnel ball removed from his brain. So that is telling us about how that injury was treated, how the shrapnel in his brain was treated. Right? See if you can identify the second one. Was yours the same as mine? So here's the second one: a warm saline solution passed along the path taken by the shrapnel to prevent infection. So again, it's telling us how infections are being treated. Okay. So now we've selected 2 quotes, let's begin to put them into sentences and start thinking about backing them up with our own knowledge. Okay, so even though this is the first one we selected, I'm actually going to go for this one first because I think the own knowledge is a little bit more simple for you guys to pick out on that one. So I would always start GCSE questions by rewording the question. So you can say source A is quite useful for showing us about the treatments available for the wounded. So simply by rewording the question, just using a nice little simple opening statement, this shows the examiner that you are focused on the question and that you know what the question is asking you. So it's saying, I know what this question is asking, I'm going to tackle it head on. Once you've done that, you then need to make an inference. So another common error on this question is going straight in for a quote or a description of the source. Okay, make an inference first. It's a lot more advanced. So source A is quite useful for showing us about the treatments available for the wounded. So here's our inference. The source suggests that solutions were used as treatments for infections. So once we made the inference, we then need to add in the quote to back it up. So there's our quote. I know this because in the source it says, always use quotation marks when you're quoting as well. Warm saline solution was passed along the path to prevent infection. Okay, so that's our first little bit done. So we've made an inference and we've selected a quote. That's our first tick of that 3-point checklist. Then we need to be adding some detailed own knowledge to back this up. So before I show you the own knowledge I've added in, I would pause the video now, open up your Western Front booklet and see if you can find a bit of own knowledge that would back up this quote that we've done. So pause now, see if you can add in the own knowledge yourself on a piece of paper. So here's the own knowledge that I added in. Was yours the same? I know this is accurate because from my own knowledge, I know that this method was typically being used by 1917 and was called the Carroll-Dakin method. By 1917, this method was known to be the most effective method for treating gas gangrene. This method was adopted because antiseptics such as carbolic acid were inefficient when treating gas gangrene. Okay, so that's our first little bit done. So we've done the tick, so we've got a tick for our inference and quote, and we've got a tick for own knowledge. So before we start trying to tackle provenance, we need to then repeat the process for the second quote that we selected. So if you want to have a go at yourself first, then I'll show you my example. So let's go back to the source. So the quote that we haven't tackled yet is this first one with the shrapnel ball removed from his brain. If you want to pause now Have a quick pause of the video, see if you can now add in, construct exactly the same like we did last time. If you want to go back to use mine as an example, see if you can construct a couple of sentences. So you're looking for an inference, then you need to insert your quote, then some own knowledge to back it up. So use your Western Front booklet to help you out with that. So here's my example. So the source also suggests that items of metal were removed from the body, as it says a man is having a shrapnel ball removed from his brain. I know this is accurate because I know that Harvey Cushing, the man that actually wrote this account, was using magnets by the end of the war in order to remove shrapnel from the brain. This method proved to be very effective. Ultimately, my own knowledge proves that this source is accurate and therefore useful. So just adding that nice little sentence in at the end as well, just again shows the examiner that you've really focused on the question. So before we move on to tackle source B and do exactly the same for B, we must finish our paragraph on source A by discussing whether the source's provenance makes it useful or not. So this is where we bring in that word provenance. So the word provenance often does scare students. Don't be scared of it. Provenance literally just means where the source comes from. So for example, who it is by and how that is relevant to what the source says. The context in which it was written or drawn for like a cartoon. So on paper 3, you might end up with something like a political cartoon if it's on, say, Vietnam, and how that relates to what the source says. So when analysing the provenance, I would select 2 things that make the source useful and then explain why those things are useful for us to use. So putting your kind of historian's hat on now, select 1 thing that makes the source not useful and explain why that makes it not useful. Okay, so 2 useful, 1 not useful is usually the path that I would go down. So let's have another look at the source. So when looking for provenance, you're using the top section here in bold. So if it's a picture source, there will still be a caption for you to use. And remember that even though a picture is solid photo evidence, if it's a photograph, we can still always criticise it by saying that a photo might have been staged. Okay, so see if you can have a go at picking out 2 things that make this source useful and 1 thing that makes it not so useful. Okay, let's have a look at my example together then. So I've said the provenance must also be considered here. I'd always start with that sentence just to show the examiner that this is where you're going to discuss provenance. So in one respect, the source's provenance makes the source more useful because the source is a journal from the time. These types of sources tend to provide detailed information written for private use. This means the source should not be exaggerated as there is no audience and it hasn't been written for any reason other than for his own personal use. This makes the source more useful. So again, we're just linking back to the question. The source is also written by one of the leading surgeons during World War One, meaning that this should be a very well informed and accurate first person testimony. So if you're talking about first person account, I would always personally say it's a first hand view, a first hand account, first person testimony, rather than using that old fashioned way of saying primary source. Okay, because I've kind of removed that now from the GCSE, further increasing the usefulness of the source. Having said this, this is only an extract of his journal, so this is where we're going to say something that's not so useful now, meaning that we are not getting a full picture entirely of Cushing's methods. This is also simply one man's perspective, so we cannot generalise from it. Therefore, overall, I think this source is somewhat useful. Okay, and there we have tackled provenance. So 2 things that are useful, 1 thing that's not so useful. So using everything we've done for source A, why don't you have a go at doing the same for source B now? So pause the video on the next slide and have a go at doing the same thing for B on your own before looking at my complete example model answer. So remember that source B is a picture source, so instead of quoting it, you will need to describe it. Literally say what you see in the source. So there's source B. I'll leave that on the screen for you if you want to go back and use some of my other sentence starters to help you out when constructing your paragraph. See if you can have a go now. Okay, did you have a go at that? So here's an example of source B. If you want to pause the video and have a read of it, that's fine, because I've realised that this video is getting quite long now. So I'm not going to read it all out to you. Just pause it, have a read, see if it matches up to what you've done. So I've described it, I've made some inferences, I've used some own knowledge to back it up, and then I've discussed the provenance at the bottom section here. And here is a full sample answer. So if you would like to pause the video and have a look, maybe take a screenshot of a full sample answer before you have a go at doing one for yourself. If you would like to, I'd maybe now have a go at one for paper 3. Thank you. Don't forget to subscribe to the Pre-Snore History Hub.